The alleyway was a throat of shadows, lit only by a single flickering streetlight that buzzed like a dying insect. Millicent's lungs burned, her breath hitching in ragged silver plumes in the Seoul night air. Every time her shoes hit the pavement, the sound felt like a flare being shot into the sky, telling him exactly where she was. Behind her, the heavy, deliberate thud of Petrus's boots didn't hurry. He didn't have to. He knew this neighborhood. He knew she had nowhere to go, and he knew that in this city she was invisible. Her heart hammered against her sternum, a trapped bird desperate to escape. Up ahead, the brick gave way to a small square. It was deserted, save for a sleek, obsidian-black sedan idling near the curb. And then she saw him. A man stood leaning against the car, the light catching the sharp edge of a white pocket square and the polished gleam of his shoes. He was perfectly composed, a statue of silk and steel in the middle of the chaos. He looked like he belonged to a world where violence was a choice, not a curse. Millicent didn't hesitate. She couldn't afford to. She lunged out of the shadows and threw herself into his space, her fingers curling into the expensive, heavy wool of his lapels. The scent of sandalwood and something cold, like iron, hit her senses. The man went completely still. He didn't push her away. He didn't move an inch. He just looked down, his dark eyes unreadable, hooded, and dangerous. "Please," Millicent whispered, her voice trembling, but her eyes fierce with the will to live. She didn't ask him to pretend. She gave him the truth. "If you walk away, he'll kill me." The stranger's gaze shifted past her, toward the shadow where Petrus had just emerged, gasping and triumphant. Millicent felt the man's body change. The stillness didn't break. It sharpened. It became the silence of a predator watching a nuisance. He didn't look at the threat. He kept his eyes on Millicent, his hand slowly rising to cover hers on his chest, claiming the chaos as his own. The transition from the cold asphalt violence of the street to the suffocating silence of the penthouse was almost too much for Millicent's senses to process. When she finally opened her eyes, she wasn't met with the peeling wallpaper of the apartment she shared with Petrus, but with floor-to-ceiling glass that looked over the sprawling, neon-lit skeleton of Seoul. The room smelled of expensive leather and air-conditioned stillness. She was lying on a sofa that felt like a cloud, a weighted silk blanket draped over her trembling frame. For a moment, she thought she was safe. Then the memory of the stillness under the streetlight came rushing back. She sat up, her heart beginning its familiar, frantic dance. Across the room, framed against the city lights, stood the man. He had removed his suit jacket, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension, and a watch that probably cost more than her abandoned degree. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring at a tablet, his face illuminated by a cold blue glow. "You're awake," he said. His voice was a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the quiet room. He didn't turn around. "The doctor said you were in shock. You've been out for 3 hours." "Where is he?" Millicent's voice was a dry rasp. "Where is Petrus?" Now Jang Uk turned. In the soft light of the penthouse, his beauty was even more terrifying. It was the beauty of a high-end blade. "He is being discouraged," he said simply. "He will not be coming here. No one comes here without my permission." Millicent looked around the room. It was a masterpiece of gold and glass, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw the details. 2 men in identical black suits stood like statues by the heavy oak doors. A collection of ancient, lethal-looking daggers was displayed in a recessed wall niche. This wasn't just a home, it was a fortress. "Who are you?" she whispered, the realization beginning to sink in. She had begged for a savior, but the weight of the air in this room told her she hadn't found a civilian. Jang Uk walked toward her, his movements fluid and predatory. He stopped just outside her personal space, looking down at her with a curious, analytical gaze. To the city, I am a businessman. To my enemies, I am the end of the line. He leaned in slightly, and the shadow of the Korean underworld seemed to darken his eyes. You asked me not to walk away, Millicent. You handed me your life under a streetlight. In my world, we don't give things back once they've been given. A new kind of chill settled in her bones. She was free from Petrus, but as she looked into the cold, protective eyes of Jang Uk, she realized she had traded a petty monster for a king. She was no longer running for her life, but she was no longer her own. The heavy iron gates of the estate were a physical manifestation of the line between Millicent's past and her present. Behind her lay the manicured gardens and the silent, towering fortress of Jang Uk. In front of her, separated by bars of reinforced steel, was the man who had spent 2 years convincing her she was nothing. Petrus looked smaller than she remembered, or perhaps it was just the scale of the world she now inhabited. He was red-faced, his clothes disheveled from days of frantic searching, screaming at the security intercom in a voice that used to make Millicent's blood turn to ice. When she saw her walking down the driveway, his expression shifted from rage to a terrifying, possessive relief.
"Millicent, get over here right now," he roared, his hands gripping the iron bars. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing or whose car that was, but you're coming home. You belong to me, do you hear? You have nothing without me." Millicent stopped 5 feet from the gate. She could feel the old instinct to flinch, to apologize, to shrink herself until she disappeared. But then a shadow fell over her. Jang Uk stepped up behind her, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the radiating heat of his presence. He wasn't dressed for a board meeting today. He wore a simple black sweater, yet he looked more lethal than any man she had ever seen. "Is this the one?" Jang Uk's voice was conversational, almost bored. "Who the hell are you?" Petra spat, his eyes darting between the two of them. "This is my girlfriend. Open this gate before I call the police." Jang Uk didn't laugh. He simply signaled to the guards. The gates hummed open with a heavy mechanical groan. Millicent's heart plummeted. Why was he letting him in? Petrus lunged forward, his hand outstretched to grab Millicent's arm, but he never reached her. In a movement so fast it was almost a blur, Jang Uk stepped into the gap. He caught Petrus by the throat, the force of the maneuver lifting the larger man onto his toes. The silence that followed was deafening. "You speak of ownership," Jang Uk whispered, leaning in until he was inches from Petrus's terrified face. "But you are a small man who confuses fear with power. Power isn't holding someone captive. Power is being able to erase someone from existence without leaving a footprint." Jang Uk's grip tightened, and Millicent saw the exact moment Petrus realized he wasn't dealing with a rival, but an apex predator. "She is under my protection," Jang Uk continued, his voice dropping to a chilling silkiness. "If you breathe in her direction again, if you even think her name, I will ensure that the rest of your life is spent wishing you had died under that streetlight." He released Petrus, who collapsed onto the gravel, gasping for air. Jang Uk didn't look back as he turned to Millicent, offering his arm. "Let's go back inside. The air is foul out here." The days that followed were draped in the finest textures Millicent had ever known. Boxes arrived at the penthouse daily, heavy cream-colored packages embossed with gold leaf. There were coats made of cashmere that felt like a second skin, silk dresses that flowed like liquid midnight, and shoes that didn't click with the frantic desperation of her old life, but whispered with a quiet, expensive confidence. Jang Uk hadn't asked for her sizes. He had simply observed her, his keen eyes catching every detail of her frame, and provided a new armor for her to wear. That evening, the air in the penthouse was thick with the scent of jollof rice and spices. Millicent had insisted on cooking, her way of reclaiming a small piece of herself in this fortress of glass.
She watched from the kitchen island as Jang Uk entered, his tie loosened, the sharp edges of his public persona slightly softened by the dim, warm light of the dining room. As they sat across from each other, the silence wasn't the heavy, suffocating kind she had endured with Petrus. It was a space that didn't need to be filled with apologies. Millicent watched him as he tasted the food, a man who lived in the center of a storm, surrounded by soldiers and secrets, yet eating with a precision that felt incredibly lonely. "You don't talk about them," Millicent said softly, her voice carrying across the polished mahogany. "The people you lost to get here." Jang Uk's spoon paused. He looked up, and for a fleeting second the Mafia boss vanished. In his eyes was the exhaustion of a man who had spent his entire life building walls so high that no one could climb them, not even to love him. "In my world, Millicent, talking about the past is a luxury I can't afford. It creates shadows where there should be focus." He set the spoon down, his gaze fixed on her. "Everyone sees the king. No one sees the man who has to sit on the throne alone to keep it." Millicent reached across the table, her hand hovering near his. She saw the faint, jagged scar running across the back of his hand, a silver line of history. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted. He wasn't just her protector anymore. He was a mirror. She had been isolated by fear. He had been isolated by power. "I know what it's like to be the only person in a crowded room," she whispered. Jang Uk didn't pull away. He turned his hand over, allowing his palm to meet hers. His skin was warm, his grip firm but careful, as if he were holding something that might shatter if he applied the same force he used on the rest of the world. In the quiet of the penthouse, high above the neon chaos of Seoul, two ghosts recognized each other. The silk on her back was new, and the scars on his heart were old, but for the first time, neither of them was alone. The golden morning light filtered through the expansive windows, casting long, elegant shadows across the room where Millicent sat. For the first time in years, she didn't wake up with a plan to survive the next hour. She simply woke up. The silence of the penthouse was no longer a threat, but a canvas. Jang Uk was standing by the balcony door, the city of Seoul humming far beneath him. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, looking every bit the sovereign of his domain. Yet as he turned to look at her, the usual frost in his expression seemed to thaw. He held a small leather-bound folder in his hand. "Petrus is gone," he said, his voice steady and devoid of the violence of the previous day. "My people have ensured he is on a flight back to the States. His visa has been revoked, and his name is flagged. He will never step foot on this peninsula again." Millicent felt a sudden, dizzying lightness, a sensation so foreign it felt like losing her balance. The phantom weight of 2 years of terror began to lift, leaving a hollow ache where her fear used to live. "I'm free?" she whispered. Jang Uk walked toward her, placing the folder on the mahogany table. "That folder contains your passport, a new student visa, and a bank account in your name. There is enough there for you to finish your degree and find an apartment of your own, far from here." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. This was the moment she expected him to demand payment, to claim the debt she owed for his protection. Instead, he took a step back, intentionally creating a chasm of space between them. "You came to me because you had no choice," he said softly. "You stayed here because you were a refugee. But I do not keep people who are forced to be here. That is what men like Petrus do." He gestured to the open floor plan, the luxury that felt like a palace in a cage. "I am asking you to stay, Millicent, not because you are afraid, and not because you have nowhere else to go. Stay as my guest. Stay because you want to see what happens when two people like us stop hiding." For the first time, the power didn't lie in his hands or in the weapons his men carried. It lay in the quiet, terrifying freedom he had just dropped into her lap. She looked at the folder, her ticket back to the world, and then at the man who had seen her at her most broken and offered her a throne instead of a leash. "If I stay," she asked, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed, "what am I to you?" Jang Uk didn't blink. "You are the only person who looked at me and didn't see a boss or a monster. You saw a man. If you stay, you are the choice I make every morning, and I want to be the choice you make too." The sanctuary of the penthouse began to feel porous, the glass walls less like a shield and more like a lens through which the rest of the world was peering in. While the ghost of Petrus had been exorcised, a heavier, more ancient shadow was moving into the space he had left behind. Millicent noticed it first in the way the air changed when Jang Uk's man arrived for their morning briefings. The silent deference they usually showed her had curdled into something sharper, a calculating coldness that made her skin prickle. One afternoon, while crossing the marble foyer, she caught the low, urgent rumble of voices coming from the study. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling onto the floor.
"She is a distraction, Chairman," a voice rasped. It was Kang, Jang Uk's most senior lieutenant, a man whose face was a map of old scars. "The syndicate is noticing. They see you spending your evenings in a kitchen instead of the counting rooms. They see a woman with no name, no family, and no leverage sitting at your table. In our world, a soft heart is just a target for a swifter blade." Millicent froze, her hand hovering near the doorframe. "My heart is not your concern, Kang," Jang Uk's voice came back, sounding like sliding ice. "And my focus has never been sharper. If the syndicate thinks her presence makes me weak, let them try to test that theory. They will find it is a very expensive mistake." "They won't test you directly," Kang countered, his tone dropping to a dangerous whisper. "They will test her, and when you move to catch her, that is when they will strike at your back." The weight of those words followed Millicent as she retreated to the balcony later that evening. She looked out at the city, but the neon lights no longer felt like a backdrop. They felt like eyes. As she leaned against the railing, she noticed a silver sedan parked 3 blocks away, idling in the same spot it had occupied for 3 nights. A man sat inside, the glow of a cigarette ember a tiny, malevolent star in the dark. He wasn't looking at the building. He was looking through a pair of long-range binoculars aimed directly at her. She realized then that her safety was an illusion. In Jang Uk's world, there were no guests, only assets or liabilities. She had traded the visible bruises of her past for an invisible crosshair. As she pulled the heavy silk of her new robe tighter around her shoulders, she understood the terrifying reality of her choice. She wasn't just a woman in love with a powerful man. She was the crack in his armor, and the entire city was waiting for the moment it finally shattered. The Grand Hyatt Ballroom was a cathedral of crystal and cold ambition, vibrating with the low hum of Seoul's elite. Millicent walked at Jang Uk's side, her stature draped in a floor-length gown of emerald silk that complemented the warmth of her skin. She could feel the weight of 1,000 stares, eyes that didn't see a woman, but a curiosity, a flaw in the chairman's carefully curated armor. Jang Uk's hand remained steady at the small of her back, his touch a silent anchor in a sea of judgment. The peace was shattered when a woman in a gown of shimmering silver, sharp enough to cut, glided toward them. This was Ji-ah, the daughter of a rival syndicate family, and the woman the underworld had long expected Jang Uk to marry for the sake of a blood-soaked alliance. Her smile was a beautiful, calculated insult. "Ji-ah?" purred Uk, her eyes sliding over Millicent as if she were a smudge on the marble floor. "I heard you had taken in a stray, but I didn't realize you were bringing your charity work to the gala. It's a bold choice. Does she even speak the language, or does she just nod when you provide the bill?" A hush fell over the surrounding circle. The air grew thin, the kind of silence that usually preceded a gunshot in Jang Uk's world.
Millicent felt the familiar urge to shrink, to let the shadow of a powerful man hide her. But then she looked at Jang Uk. He wasn't moving to defend her. He was watching her, his expression a quiet challenge. He was giving her the one thing Petrus never had, the floor. Millicent stepped forward, closing the inch of space between her and the silver-clad heiress. She didn't raise her voice. "I speak 3 languages, Jia, and I understand a 4th one perfectly, the sound of a woman who realizes she's become irrelevant." The heiress's smile faltered, her champagne flute trembling slightly. "Jang Uk didn't find me in the gutter," Millicent continued, her voice like velvet-wrapped steel. "He found me in a moment of truth. You've spent your whole life playing a part in a script written by your father. I am the only person in this room who is here because I chose to be, not because I was assigned a seat." Jia's face contorted, her polished mask cracking. "You're a temporary amusement, a liability. He will discard you the moment the syndicate demands it. Then he will be discarding the only person who sees him for who he is." Millicent turned her gaze back to Jang Uk. For the first time that evening, Jang Uk smiled, a rare, dangerous glint of pride. He didn't say a word to Jia. He simply offered his arm to Millicent, turning his back on the heiress in a gesture of total dismissal. As they moved toward the center of the room, Millicent realized that the silk she wore wasn't just a gift, it was a uniform. She wasn't a guest anymore. She was a player. The transition from the glitter of the gala to the gore of the asphalt happened in the heartbeat between 2 breaths. They were in the back of the armored sedan, the scent of the night air still clinging to Millicent's emerald silk when the world turned upside down. A sudden bone-jarring impact sent the car spinning, the shriek of metal on metal drowning out the city's hum. "Stay down!" Jang Uk's voice was no longer silk, it was a command of iron. Before the car had even stopped sliding, the night erupted in the rhythmic staccato of gunfire. Shatterproof glass spiderwebbed as black SUVs swarmed the convoy like sharks smelling blood. Jang Uk kicked the door open, his silhouette a sharp contrast against the orange flare of muzzle flashes. He pulled Millicent from the wreckage, shielding her with his own body as his men returned fire. "The subway entrance, 300 yards south," he hissed into her ear, his eyes scanning the chaos with a terrifying surgical focus. "Don't look back, don't stop, I'll find you. Uk, go!" A grenade detonated nearby, the shockwave throwing her forward. In the smoke and the screaming, a wall of black-clad men surged between them, cutting the line of sight. Millicent was alone. She didn't run like she had from Petrus. This wasn't the blind flight of a victim. It was the calculated escape of a woman who had been taught how to survive by the best. She stripped off her heels, the cold pavement biting into her soles, and ducked into a narrow service alley. Behind her, she heard the heavy footsteps of 2 men, not Petrus's clumsy gait, but the disciplined stride of professionals. She reached a dead end, a row of industrial dumpsters and a rusted fire escape. Her heart hammered, but her mind was cold. She didn't scream. She grabbed a discarded iron pipe from the debris, her fingers bruising against the metal, and climbed atop a dumpster, pressing herself into the deep shadows of an alcove. When the first shadow rounded the corner, his silenced pistol leading the way, he didn't look up. He expected a terrified girl cowering in a corner. As he passed, Millicent didn't hesitate. She swung the pipe with every ounce of the rage she had suppressed for years, the metal connecting with the back of his tactical helmet with a sickening thud. As he slumped, she didn't wait to see if he breathed. She grabbed his fallen radio and scrambled up the fire escape, her green dress snagging and tearing. High above the alley, she huddled in the dark, listening to the frantic Korean chatter on the radio. They were looking for a liability. They were looking for his weakness. But as Millicent stared down at the chaos below, her eyes hard and her grip steady, she knew they had made a mistake. She wasn't the weakness. She was the only thing they hadn't accounted for. The radio in Millicent's hand crackled with a frantic, rhythmic sequence of codes. Through the static, she heard the location, the old shipyard on the Han River. It was a kill zone. She remembered the dinner from weeks ago, the way Jang Uk's thumb had traced the scar on his hand as he whispered about his father's ghost exit, a hidden ventilation shaft beneath the shipyard's primary loading dock, designed for a desperate escape. It was a secret he had shared not as a boss, but as a man who was tired of being hunted. By the time Millicent reached the perimeter of the docks, the night was screaming with the sound of automatic fire. The syndicate had Jang Uk pinned against the rusted hull of a dry-docked freighter. He was out of ammunition, his silhouette visible under the harsh sweep of a searchlight, looking like a king waiting for his executioners. Millicent didn't approach from the front. She moved through the bowels of the shipyard, her emerald dress now a tattered battle flag, until she found the heavy steel grate hidden beneath a stack of rotted pallets. Using the iron pipe, she pried the latch loose, the metal groaning in protest. Below lay the dark, narrow tunnel Jang Uk had described, the secret path that bypassed the syndicate's blockade. She scrambled through the damp darkness, emerging behind the shipping containers just as the rival gunmen closed in for the final strike. "Uk!" she hissed, her voice cutting through the ringing in his ears. Jang Uk turned, his face smeared with blood and oil, his eyes widening in shock as he saw her emerging from the shadows of the earth. He didn't hesitate. He dived into the darkness of the shaft just as a volley of bullets shredded the air where he had been standing. Inside the narrow safety of the tunnel, the silence was heavy and thick with the scent of salt and copper. Jang Uk slumped against the damp wall, gasping for air, his hand gripping his side where a dark stain was blooming across his white shirt. He looked at Millicent, at her bare, bloodied feet, her ruined gown, and the iron pipe still clutched in her trembling hand. "I told you to run," he rasped, his voice breaking. "I told you to stay safe. You shouldn't be here." "You told me I was a choice," Millicent replied, her voice steady even as her lungs burned. "I chose to stay. I chose to listen." Jang Uk reached out, his bloody fingers curling around her hand. For months, his lieutenants had whispered that she was the vulnerability that would bring him down. But as he looked at the woman who had navigated a war zone to pull him from the mouth of the grave, the realization hit him with more force than any bullet. She wasn't the crack in his armor. She was the iron that reinforced it. He didn't need to protect her from his world. Together, they would burn it down and build something new. "They were wrong," he whispered, leaning his forehead against hers. "You aren't my weakness, Millicent. You are the only reason I'm still standing." The seasons in Seoul shifted with a quiet, poetic grace, the violence of the winter melt giving way to a spring that smelled of cherry blossoms and rain. The shipyard was a memory now, a scar on the city skyline that had been paved over by a new order. Jang Uk's empire had been purged. The syndicate rivals who had sought to exploit his weakness were gone, replaced by a peace that was as absolute as his rule. But it was a different kind of rule now, one that didn't rely solely on the cold edge of a blade, but on the steady, unyielding strength of the woman who sat beside him. Millicent walked through the penthouse, the emerald silk of her gown replaced by a simple, elegant cream suit. She was no longer a ghost haunting the hallways of a golden cage. She had finished her degree, her name now carried weight in the city's academic circles, and she had become a bridge between Jang Uk's shadow world and the light of the public eye. She was his advisor, his confidant, and the only person allowed to see the man behind the chairman's mask. The sun was setting over the Han River, casting a warm, honeyed glow across the balcony where Jang Uk stood. He no longer was the sleeping dragon she had met under a flickering streetlight. He looked at peace. As she approached, he turned, his dark eyes softening in a way that still made her heart catch. He didn't speak at first. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. When he opened it, a diamond caught the dying light, a brilliant, singular spark that seemed to hold all the resilience they had shared. "I spent my whole life building walls because I thought love was a liability," Jang Uk said, his voice a low, steady vow. I thought that to be powerful, I had to be alone. But you taught me that the greatest power isn't in what you can take, but in what you are willing to protect." He took her hand, the same hand that had gripped a rusted pipe in a dark alley to save his life, and slipped the ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit, a circle of fire and ice. "You came to me running for your life," he whispered, stepping closer until their foreheads touched. "You gave me the truth when I lived in a world of lies. Now I give you my word. As long as I draw breath, this city, this house, and my heart are your fortress. You will never have to run again, Millicent. You are home." Millicent looked out at the city, the lights of Seoul twinkling like a carpet of stars beneath them. The fear that had defined her for years was gone, replaced by a deep, resonant belonging. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She was a queen, and by his side, she was finally free.